Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. Public sector workers have begun strike action over wages and remote work. It is the biggest job action by government workers in decades. The opposition has expressed their disappointment with the strike. The NDP hopes a deal can be reached without back-to-work legislation. The two sides are still at the table talking.
We are still at the table. We're going to continue to talk. If there's a willingness on the employer side, we'll continue through this weekend. We'll stay there for as long as it takes to get to a deal, because that's our goal.
As you know, the strike has begun. We're still at the table negotiating, and hopefully we'll make some progress today. I'm convinced we can.
So what's to be made of the Labour action, and how is the government managing it all? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Althia and in for Mr. Coyne tonight, Paul Wells. Good to see you all. Appreciate you being here. Althia, I'll start with you. Do you think a strike was could have been avoided, or was this inevitable given how long negotiations had been going on?
Well, it seemed like the union actually wanted a strike, and that's what people internally will tell you. So I think that there was part of this was, I don't want to say unavoidable, because the government could have just given the union everything it wanted. Yeah. But I think there was a willingness and a readiness from the union to bring it to the picket line, and a willingness to stay there. And they have a big strike fund, and they could, be there for months if that's what they decide to do. What's interesting is that they haven't started making their case to the public yet. If you look back at the support that the labor movement got last fall when Doug Ford brought in the notwithstanding clause to bring workers back to work, one of the reasons why there was so much public support was because those were really the lowest paid workers. And the union has not communicated that, we're not talking about the executives in the government here. They haven't talked really to the public. So that's in a way a good sign, because it means that they are still negotiating. They haven't taken their case to the public yet. But if the government decides to dig in their heels, and they might on this back to work stuff, on the remote work stuff, because I think that's a bigger sticking point than the actual salary increase. I think they will have to start making that argument. Otherwise, the public is going to get really frustrated and angry about the lack of services that they are getting.
Though, Paul, a lot of these people, from what I understand, make anywhere between $40,000 to $60,000 a year. And if you're dealing with an inflation crisis, interest rate hikes, you can understand how the union can make a pretty good case there that these people who Canadians depend on maybe need to be paid more.
Absolutely. I mean, their purchasing power has been diminishing thanks to inflation. And they are probably not unaware that if the next election goes a different way, that a future government might be a lot less sympathetic than the Trudeau government, which, after all, has proven itself a pretty soft touch on questions of spending over the last 7 years. And so I think they figure they should take their chances. The problem is, even though it's true, these are frontline workers. These are not the big decision makers of the public service. And they do make quite modest salaries. People who make similarly modest salaries out in the rest of the economy can't count on very large salary increases year after year after year. They don't, if you work at a Costco or something, your boss is not able to provide the kinds of salaries and benefits that these folks are asking for.
Well, maybe they're able, but they're unwilling.
Yeah. I suppose we could ask Galen Weston. He's got some time to talk about that sort of thing now. So there is a challenge in gathering public sympathy for the sort of demands that these folks are making.
Yeah, Chantal?
It's usually been hard for public servants because of the benefits, not only those they are asking, but those that they do enjoy tend to make the public less sympathetic towards, and the fact that they tend to have job security. That being said, the government is in a difficult political place for a number of reasons. You can bet that premiers across the country are hoping that Justin Trudeau will hold the line on wage increases. Why? Because of the trickle-down effect of whatever happens in this negotiation to the negotiations that will be coming in most provinces over the next year, 2 years. So whatever the federal government gives will become a template for what happens in the provinces. But politically, The other problem the Liberals have is that the public pressure, when the public does lose patience, and it will be on them. The NDP is happy enough to stand with unions and to say, well, you know, Justin Trudeau always said he was your friend, but look at this test of that friendship and how it's turning out. Ditto for the Bloc Québécois. And I think the Conservatives believe, possibly rightly, that they can put this on Justin Trudeau, say, look, he can't even handle the civil service and keep public servants on the job. So when the Prime Minister hints at back to work legislation, you've got to wonder who in the world will be his dancing partner, because at this point no one is stepping up to say me, me, me.
Well, also because, Althia, we're now in a space where all parties court the Labour vote to varying degrees of success. Doug Ford certainly, his win is in large part because of that. So Chantal's right. There's so many people that want to keep people happy here. So many parties that want to keep people happy.
Yeah, I mean, it would be suicidal for the NDP to decide to support back-to-work legislation. They cannot do that at all. Ironically, I guess there could be an opening for the Bloc if they decided to give the government that, but what would they be negotiating in return? The Conservatives, I think Chantal is right, will let the Liberals hang out to dry as long as possible, but they're also in an interesting position. Like, I've been noticing Stephanie Kusi, who's a Calgary MP, who's actually a former public servant herself, who's been asking questions, but they're trying to make it sound like the government is incompetent and can't manage public financing. Not that they would actually do anything different. And that's the challenge, right? I mean, if the Conservatives were in this position, I'm not sure that the union would feel so emboldened, which is kind of the irony in all this. Paul?
Yeah, Pierre Poilievre was on Twitter and said that you've got to be super incompetent to have the largest expansion of the public service in decades and the biggest public service strike in decades. That's a great line, but Poilievre also famously said, we don't want a government that can run your life, we want a government that can run a passport office. This is this year's passport office. What he would actually do remains an interesting question. He's got a lot of public servants in his riding.
Yes.
Those public servants made things hot for him in 2015. But he runs a party that is a lot less sympathetic to public service demands, and he's been running it in a way that would suggest that if it were logical with itself, it would continue to be unsympathetic to those demands. If the question's put, and if the real question is not, do you support this law, but do you feel like this is worth going into an election on, I think that's a harder question for Pierre Poilievre than for some of his colleagues.
30 seconds, Chantal.
Well, I can't imagine that the government would wiggle itself into a confidence vote over a strike that it would still fail to resolve if it went into an election, for one. And two, it's one of the perks of opposition to not have to say or do whatever you would do if you were sitting in the chair.
Welcome to another round of At Issue and a political debate about the CBC, courtesy of Twitter. After an appeal from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, Twitter's CEO Elon Musk changed CBC's Twitter label to government funded, which Twitter defines as an outlet that has government involvement in the editorial content. The CBC paused its use of the platform because of the suggestion it is not independent. Poilievre claimed victory, tweeting this and adding fodder to his calls to defund the CBC, something the Liberals jumped on for their own political reasons.
His issues with the CBC has brought him to involve American tech giants to try and attack the local news, the local culture, the francophone news that Canadians rely on from coast to coast to coast.
So what do these week's events tell us about the way the CBC is being used politically now and how it will be in the future, and is it effective? Let's bring back everybody, Chantal, Althia, and Paul. Chantal, why don't you start us off here? Do you think that this is a winning strategy for Pierre Poilievre, that there is a conversation that people are eager to have around this, and that using the Elon Musk ploy, which has been used with many other public broadcasters in the world in the past couple of weeks, is a smart idea?
Well, if it were a conversation, it would certainly be worth having.
Sure.
But the way it has been led by the Conservatives and their leader is not the way of a conversation. You can't start a conversation by saying the CBC is a propaganda tool. it's just too easy, and then not be able to answer, well, how exactly would you go about defunding the CBC and not Radio-Canada? And how would you explain to Canadians that you would be funding a service for one language group in this country and not the other? There are plenty of questions to be asked. That being said, usually when a leader takes a stance and pursues it as aggressively, his MPs are eager to echo it, and some of them were. But in Quebec this week, the entire Quebec caucus literally turned into ghosts. They would not go on any radio show, on any TV show, to kind of expound on where their leader was going. And the reason for that is that they know that in their own communities, it's not a great battle horse to say if I'm Radio-Canada is a problem for me. And so it's rare that you see MPs run away from their own leader's position. I'm not saying a gaffe, a deliberate strategy that has his own MPs hiding under their beds rather than account for it.
What's interesting too, Althia, is not just what Pierre Poilievre is doing, which he's been very open about publicly, but is also the way the Liberals and the Prime Minister position themselves around this as the great defender of it all.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the CBC has suddenly become this wedge issue where the Liberals are now fundraising off of the CBC. And I guess, should we all just declare that we have a conflict, or is it just so obvious that we don't need to declare that we have a conflict in talking about the CBC and its funding? So many ways to take this. It's like I'm not, first of all, on the Twitter stuff, Pierre Poilievre has decided to pay for his blue check mark. So I guess you could argue, or certainly ask the question, whether his paying of Elon Musk is cash for access and Elon Musk is doing him a favor to help him in his campaign. At the same time that Chantal mentioned that Pierre Poilievre is talking about CBC as Trudeau's propaganda, which is what he called it this week, he is using CBC's reporting to attack the government in question period. The story about the Jamaican vacation, that is a story from Radio-Canada. Like, I'm a big fan of the CBC. I grew up listening to Morningside and watching Peter Mansbridge with my dad on TV and Cross Country Checkup, and I think it's one of these institutions that knits the country together, and we get to learn about each other from coast to coast, and I would be really sad to see it leave. But I do think that so much of this is a self-inflicted wounds that CBC is engaging in themselves. Like, I don't know, and this is not to you, Rosie, but to the people running the CBC, like, don't get involved in this mess. And constantly, they are not doing themselves any favors. Like, most people will look at Twitter and say government funded. Like, of course you're government funded. You receive $1.2 billion annually from the government. They may not read the Twitter fine print. So I wish that there was a little bit of maturity from the part of the CBC in detangling itself from the political gamesmanship on this issue and letting it play out without them being an actor in it, so that we can try to safeguard the CBC. Sorry, end of rant.
Paul.
One hardly knows where to begin. Look, on the substance of the thing, the CBC is not the Vatican. It should be perfectly normal for people to ask questions about its utility. 100 years after it made perfect sense to establish a Canadian presence in the then new technologies of radio and television, it's now just as obvious that there is just a hell of a lot of competition for viewers and readers and listeners' time and attention, and that the CBC, like any one of us, is struggling to hold on to its footing. It's also very obvious to an awful lot of people who watch the CBC that certain political viewpoints are presented more frequently than other political viewpoints, and that bugs the kind of people who Pierre Poilievre needs to vote for him. And I think the last thing is, it was a very strange thing that after everything that Elon Musk has been doing for the last year, saying an obvious and notorious truth on the CBC's account, that it receives money from the government, was the thing that made the CBC decide to get off Twitter. I didn't even need Elon Musk to get off Twitter. It's easy to get off Twitter. More people should do it.
Yeah.
Now, having defended Poilievre to that extent, I will say there's a question of priorities. There's a shooting war in Europe going on right now. He hasn't had a thing to say about that for a year. Picking this as his next fight confuses even those people who might be amenable to voting Conservative, because it's about 80th on most of their priority lists.
Yeah. And when you talk to Conservatives, what they say is that this continues to be a red meat issue for them, that it's something that they want to talk about, as do Liberals for that very same reason, Chantal.
Yes, but it does become a competence issue. If you're going to make this really important, then it's a public policy issue. You need to think it out. I'll give you one example. Pierre Poilievre says he would preserve Radio-Canada. Set aside the difficulties in keeping one and not the other, because it gives French language information to communities outside Quebec that have no other French language outlet. Fine. So, except they only manage to exist because of the CBC infrastructure.
That's right.
For one. Second, and more to the substantial point, Radio-Canada is the only outlet, the only media in Quebec that actually brings in stories from outside Quebec. So if you want Quebec to be even more insular, well, get rid of those antennas across the country, and it's going to be fine. I mean, you can fill Newscast with Quebec news. It's not very hard. But if from just a nation-preserving perspective, you need to think about these things and be able to answer those questions if you're going to seriously say, as a future Prime Minister, I believe the CBC is now a propaganda tool that I would not want as Prime Minister, so I would wind it down.
Quickly, Althia, and then Paul. Althia.
He will wind it down and use the CBC buildings for social housing, apparently. I don't know that he needs to say publicly what he would do. I mean, these are questions that we're interested in, but the people that he's speaking to are not interested in the details. This is the biggest, cheer getter during his leadership contest. Whenever he went to a rally and he talked about defunding the CBC, it got really, really loud cheers. It's very popular with a certain group of people who probably, frankly, don't actually watch the CBC. I think the CBC's biggest defense, frankly, is to just do its job properly, prove your worth, and then people will see value in it.
Paul, last word.
On this question of a conflict of interest, it's not only the CBC. Thanks to a bunch of essentially ineffectual bailouts to large newspaper companies, which I fought every step of the way every time anyone asked me, every reporter in every scrum in the next federal election will be in an obvious conflict of interest. There's a government that wants to extend those subsidies, and there's a government that claims to want to shut down the English CBC. There's a party that wants to shut down the English CBC and end those newspaper subsidies. It doesn't matter what the reporters think or whether it affects their work. The fact that someone could reasonably ask that question shatters the credibility of most of the journalists who are going to cover the next election. There's nothing those reporters can do about it. It's a big problem.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all.